Residency interviews aren't about impressing anyone, and that's why you're bombing them. The first time I did an interview, I walked in hoping that they would just like me. I tried to sound really impressive, and what happened is that I stumbled over everything. Someone literally had told me that I was the worst interviewer with the best application that they had ever seen. Here's the problem. We worry so much about saying the perfect answer that we miss the entire point. I see the same thing with every single student that I work with. We get nervous because we're trying to impress people instead of just having a conversation and solving a problem together. When I figured this out, everything changed. I went from that disaster to having 4 out of my top 5 residency programs, including Harvard MGH, tell me that I was ranked to match well before I even submitted my rank list. Today, I'm breaking down the 10 things that separate people who bomb interviews from people who crush them. And here's the good news. Because most people suck at interviews anyway, the gap is smaller than you think. This is something that you can learn, literally anyone can learn it, with a little bit of guidance and practice. Be sure to stick around to the end because I'm going to ask you one question that will instantly reveal whether you're going to crush your interviews or bomb them. And here's the thing, most med students get this wrong even after watching videos like this. The first key is that you have to understand that you're being hired to solve a problem. The biggest mistake that people make in interviews is thinking that it's about them. Remember, it's not. Instead, it's about the problem that the program needs to solve and you becoming the solution to that problem. Remember this and tattoo this to your forehead. Reframe the goal of when you go into an interview of instead of trying to be impressive, they need residents to show up, to do the work, to be reliable. For top programs, oftentimes what they're also trying to solve is they're trying to improve essentially their brand, right? They want people who are going to be leaders in the field, either as researchers, oftentimes that's what they're looking for, or who are going to be the heads of their practice, or go on to basically be a mover and shaker in some way. So instead of trying to convince them that you're impressive, instead show them that you are the solution to their problem. When you do this, everything changes. George Clooney, the famous actor, early on in his career, was going from audition to audition, trying to impress the casting directors. He got really frustrated and took it really personally when they ended up going with other people for the roles. Then he realized that really they're not trying to make his life difficult, they're actually just trying to solve a problem. Casting directors need someone who's going to be reliable through pre-production, production, post-production, promotion. Once he understood this, he stopped trying to perform for them and instead started to try to solve the problems with them. So how can you use this to make program directors just drool over your application? Remember that they're not trying to judge you. Instead, really at core, they're asking themselves, is this person going to make my life and the lives of the program easier or harder? One of the best ways that I saw this described was an interviewer said something like, can I trust this person at 2 a.m.? If I were to see my name next to their name, and I knew that we were going to be on call overnight, am I going to be like, yeah, I'm super excited? Or like, oh my God, it's gonna be one of those nights, right? Are they gonna show up? Are they gonna work well with the team? It's not about being the most impressive. Instead, it's about being the person that they can count on. Understanding this took all of the pressure off of me and instead helped me to really see what the purpose of the interview was and help me tailor the rest of everything. So if the key is about solving their problem, what is it that you are offering as a solution? That's where we get to number 2. Number 2 is to know your brand. If you don't know what you stand for, how is anyone else supposed to figure it out in a 30-minute interview? Your brand is really just your thesis statement, right? If you think about your personal statement, it's the one line that encapsulates everything that there is about you. It's not a list of accomplishments. Instead, it's the theme that will tie the rest of the interview together. Everything in your interview should really connect back to this. This is an actual personal statement from someone who matched at his top choice for an anesthesia residency. His thesis statement and ultimately his brand was, I will continue to apply fundamental concepts in my career as an anesthesiologist, patient care advocate, and educator. Notice how specific this is. He's using the theme of, okay, I like understanding fundamental concepts. He tied it into his actual personal statement, which was all about diving. Throughout the entire essay, it tied back to that one theme. In addition to that, for the interviews, all of his answers could tie back to it. If someone asked him about his research, he could tie it back to, I love understanding and applying fundamental concepts. My research really ties into that fact because of X, Y, and Z. If someone asked him, why is he interested in anesthesia? He could say the exact same thing. What this did is that it made his statement much more memorable and created a lot of coherence. If he didn't have a brand, what oftentimes I see is that people will just list off random facts. Someone will volley a question at you and they'll just hit it right back just like they would in a tennis match, where it's just whatever comes into mind, they're going to just say it. Instead, with a brand, every answer is going to reinforce the same narrative. Instead of just being another generic person, you are the person who does X. In his case, he was the person that applied fundamental concepts and who was a diver. This makes interviews so much easier because you always know what it is to highlight, right? One of the hardest things that I ran into was I didn't ever know what it is that I was supposed to say. Having a brand or a common theme that you can come back to makes it so much easier, first of all, to write your essay, if you're still in the process of writing your essay, or if you've already written your essay, to have something that you can come back to so that you know how to answer the questions more easily. So how do you find your brand if you haven't done this already? Try to figure out what's the common thread among all of those things. Second, try to ask yourself, what do people come to you for? What do you want to be known for in the next 5 years? Whatever it is, you should try to be authentic and not just think of what it is that they want to hear. Every story, every answer to a question, everything can really start with your brand and then you build from there. So if that student were to be asked in an interview, tell me about yourself, he could easily say something like, I have always loved in everything that I've done to understand and apply fundamental concepts. I do this in my clinical practice, I did this in my learning, and I intend to do this, continue to do this in education because I would love to continue to be a part of education in the future. So now you know your brand, but different programs care about different things. That's why you also need to know this next thing, which brings us to number 3, know your audience. Your brand tells you what to offer. Your audience tells you what parts of that brand to emphasize. So why does this matter? You've probably got maybe 20 different stories or 20 different points that you could highlight from your application. The key is that only 2 to 3 are ever really gonna land with any given person. The problem is that you have to figure out which of them matter because you don't wanna be talking about your clinical education to the person that cares a lot about research, just like you wouldn't want to talk about your research to the person that really is only focused on clinical education. But how do you actually figure out what your audience cares about? This is where the next point comes in. Number 4 is ask transformational, not transactional questions. People remember how you made them feel, not what you said. And a great question makes them feel just as good as a great answer. A transactional question is something like logistics. It'd be something like call schedule, how much money am I gonna make, what's the vacation time, things that really could be answered on a website. A transformational question, by contrast, is going to be something that's really going to get to something deeper for them. You'll know that you've asked a good transformational question because they'll oftentimes look up and to the right. You'll see them thinking pretty deeply. Like look at it as almost a game, like a fact-finding mission. You've got about 20 things that you could probably talk about. For any given person, there's only 2 or 3 that they're really going to connect with you on. And so you want to ask questions that are going to allow you to surface those things that they really value and the things that they really care about. An example for a transformational question would be something like when the admissions committee meets at year end and someone says, oh my God, that resident was amazing. I wish that we had 20 more like them. What stood out about that person? Another great question that you're going to want to remember for the post-interview follow-up is what's been your favorite moment training residents? Or similarly, tell me about the biggest transformation you ever saw in a resident that you were a part of. Another example would be, what are 3 things that someone should never, ever do during residency? And so especially the questions where they're talking about themselves, asking questions about the transformations that they've seen in residents, especially the ones that they've been a part of, is a really subtle way that you can be extremely memorable and to figure out exactly who the audience is that you're talking to. In general, for people that are in academic medicine, they're doing academic medicine not because of the money, right? Because you certainly don't make more in academic medicine than you would in private practice. Instead, the people that are in academic medicine are doing it because they really care about helping other people. Instead of them talking about their own accomplishments, you want to get them to talk about things where they've helped other residents and seen really immense growth, because that's what they really are invested in. And then as soon as they say that, you can then bring in a story of yourself, right? And so if someone says, oh my gosh, I saw this amazing, incredible transformation from this resident where when they first came in, they were not very confident. They didn't really know what it is that they were doing. They didn't really feel very comfortable speaking up on rounds. And I took them aside once and I just told them, hey, you know what? You're here for a reason. And there is, I see so much potential in you, you can do this. And that person from that time on, they just went forth and they were like a resident on fire. It was crazy. They did all of these amazing things, etc., etc. After they've told that story, you can then come in and say something like, oh my gosh, I had a similar experience with a mentor who said almost the exact same thing to me, where I was feeling kind of nervous. I wasn't really sure what my place was. And, just having that mentorship, having that person who could look from the outside and say, hey, you know what, you can really do this. It made such an immense difference. And then in addition to that, it led to X accomplishment and X accomplishment. It's said in response to something that they have said. Now you have tied your story to something that is deeply meaningful to them. And especially if it's like their favorite memory, they can't help but remember you because you've now tied your experience to theirs. Be sure to watch until the end because I will explain how you can use this even more to supercharge this after the interview to maximize your chances of matching. One thing you do want to remember is to save the transactional questions like call schedule, vacations, you get a iPad stipend for residence, or time outside of the interview. These are things that generally can easily be found on a website, and not necessarily because they're gonna look down on you, but because you could use that time much more productively by asking transformational questions. Okay, so you're asking great questions. Now here's the hard part. You actually have to do this one thing or else none of it's gonna matter. That brings us to number 5, which is listen more than you talk. Sales is often called the purest of sports. And in sales, the person who talks the most is usually the one that does the losing. Most people think that interviews are about performing, talking, and impressing. In reality, the best interviewers, just like the best salespeople, listen much more than they talk. There was a study that was done, I don't know, years ago, where they looked at the most effective salespeople, and it was something like 54% of the time they spent listening, and only about 46% of the time they spent talking. Remember, your job is to understand what it is that they need and what problem that it is that they're trying to solve, not to monologue about yourself. Listening matters because just asking the question is the first step to understand what it is that they truly value. You have to really listen and reflect back what it is that they're saying to make sure that you truly understand where they're coming from. Only then can you tailor your responses to address those specific things. This will show that you're actually engaged, not just waiting for your turn to talk. Think back to the people that you enjoy talking to the most. In general, are they the people where they just like talk? Or are they the people that just listen intently and are just paying such close attention and hanging on your every word? Of course, it's the people that listen. I mean, they've done studies on this, but really, it's just kind of common sense. And so you want to be that person in the conversation. I think one of the biggest beliefs that I had to break for myself was just thinking that, okay, it's an interview, so I just have to go and I need to talk as much as possible because they just want to hear my responses. In reality, all they're doing is listening to most people. And so if you're that one person that just sits there and actually asks them questions and then asks thoughtful follow-up questions, you will be the one in a million that they're going to talk to. So you're listening and you understand what they care about. Now, when it's your turn to talk, here's how to structure your answers. Number 6, show, don't tell. You never want to say something like, I'm good at clinical medicine. Instead, tell a story where that's the only possible conclusion that they could reach. Just like in personal statements, if you state a quality, it's going to be forgettable and they're not going to believe you. Instead, you want to tell a story that illustrates those qualities. Not only is it more memorable, but it's also a lot more believable. For example, one of my students was an IMG in Saudi Arabia. She was a family medicine resident that wanted to do residency in the United States. And so she was treating a patient who was a 50-year-old woman in a very conservative culture, and no one knew what was wrong with her. She had a bunch of kind of random symptoms, and she thought to herself, you know what? I know this sounds kind of crazy, but this almost sounds like HIV. And so despite the fact that everyone was like, no, you're crazy, no way that this is HIV, she did the test anyways, and it turned out that it was positive. Think about the impression that you got about her. Did I have to tell you that she was good at thinking outside the box? Did I have to tell you that she was clinically strong? Did I have to tell you that she trusted her reasoning and followed her hunches? No, right? The story says everything for you. I know that she's willing to advocate for patients because I can see clearly that she was willing to do it, despite the fact that it went against a number of cultural and sort of hospital norms. So how to apply this? For every quality that you want to convey, have a story that is ready so that you can illustrate this. The story should make that quality the inescapable conclusion. And you want to practice telling these stories concisely so that maybe at most it might be a minute. Okay, so you need stories, but how do you prepare them without sounding like a robot that's reading from a script? That brings us to number 7, rehearse the ideas, not the wording. The moment that you sound like you're reading from memory, you've already lost them. The problem with memorizing is that generally people can smell scripted answers. You're gonna sound robotic, you're gonna sound inauthentic. And then the other issue is that as soon as they ask you something slightly different from the way that you prepared, you're going to panic. I remember I had a student once, she did extremely well on step 2. I think she got like 265 and she had great research and she was just overall this fantastic candidate. But every single time she got to an interview, she would panic. Even though she got tons of interviews, she ended up not matching her first year. So what did we do to practice? What we did is we had her rehearse the ideas of what it is that she was going to do instead of just having sort of these scripted answers. Because every single time she had a scripted answer, one of two things would happen. The first possibility was that she got a question that she had prepared for. That was not great because she would say something that came off as very, very scripted. She would talk at length and she would kind of stumble over her words, but it just sounded really empty. It's kind of hard to demonstrate. Or the alternative was that they would ask her a question that she hadn't prepared for and she would just get really, really, really flustered. Instead, because she had a brand that she could bring everything back to, and she had ideas of how it is that she wanted to answer the questions, she would just practice answering those questions again and again. And what you'll find is that the more that you practice the ideas, even if it's not the exact question that you prepared for, oftentimes because you've rehearsed ideas, when they ask you a question that's somewhat related, you can use that same idea in your response. The key thing is that you want to practice as many different times as possible and in as many different contexts as possible. So oftentimes what I would do is I would sit there with a friend and we would just go back and forth and ask each other different variations of questions that we were expecting to get in an interview. Things like, tell me about yourself, or what's your greatest strength, or what's your greatest weakness. In general, most of the questions that they're asking, again, if you understand that they're trying to solve a problem, they're really trying to figure out, are you going to be a jerk, right? What are the things that they can expect from you? What's sort of the risk reward benefit? And so once you understand that, it becomes a lot easier for you then to figure out that honestly, there's not that many kinds of responses that you can give. Oftentimes you'll find that you'll be able to reuse answers from one question to another as long as you're focusing on the idea itself. Speaking of preparation, let's talk about what you should actually do before you walk into that interview room. This brings us to number 8, prepare and research strategically before the interview. Research isn't about memorizing facts from their website. Instead, it's about finding enough information so that you can generate thoughtful questions to then use to further the conversation. I think one mistake that I see people make is that they're trying to impress people with just how much they know, right? It's like the med student that writes this really immense long note because they want to show just how much time they put in. I kind of see the same thing with people that are preparing for interviews, is that they learn everything about the program, and then they feel sort of obliged to try to share that during the interview itself. Remember, you're not trying to prove that you did your homework. Instead, you're trying to have meaningful conversations. So what you do want to do is to look for things that are genuinely interesting to you about the program. Identify unique aspects and use the research to generate questions that you know that you will be able to ask and pull out during the interview itself. Recent program changes, new initiatives, special tracks. For example, a good transformational question would be something like, what's the thing that you're most excited about with the program right now? A good follow-up question would be, oh, I saw that you had made that program where you have people sort of learn data science along in their residency program. What's been the biggest challenge that you found with that initiative? That shows that you care about the program and that you know about it, and especially if you are interested in data science, right? That's a great question because then it allows you to talk about your interest in that and kind of gauge what it is that they find interesting to begin with. Now, no matter how well you prepare, they're going to ask you difficult questions. This is how you handle them. Number 9 is handle difficult questions head on. The worst thing you can do with a red flag is to try to hide it or dance around it. Instead, you want to address it directly. So I've talked to a number of different program directors, including a number of different program directors at Harvard. And what they tell me is basically some version of program directors are risk averse. Every program director has sort of those nightmare scenarios where they let in someone who they thought was going to be great, and then for whatever reason, it did not go the way that they planned. Stories that I know of personally or that I've heard from other people are things like, oh, they couldn't pass their board exam and they got dismissed from the residency. Or, for example, they were just an awful person to work with. They were not coachable, or, something like that. If you think about interviews as sales, what you need to do is you've got to figure out what their objection is, right? What would be the reason that they wouldn't want to hire you, and get them to surface it, and then have a way that you can address it. In other words, you need to understand what they're actually afraid of and then show them that it's not going to happen. So for example, let's say that you failed your exam. Their fear is that you're going to fail again during residency, because there's plenty of examples of this happening. So the bad answer would be to make an excuse or to downplay it. Instead, the ideal would be that you acknowledge it, You show what changed, and then you provide evidence. So for example, we were working with a student who had needed a lot of extra time to pass step 1. It didn't look great on his application, and he was an IMG. Already he was behind the 8 ball. But what he was able to say was, you know what, I completely overhauled my approach. I worked with a coach, and I scored a 262 on step 2. His theme, or his brand, was, I always learn from my personal setbacks. And so he said something like, I have always fallen down, but then I come back stronger. And so, yes, I did not know how to study for step 1 well. I was using the completely wrong approach, and it showed in my results. But I also learned that I could completely transform my approach. And in doing so, I reached a completely different level that I never would have reached, had I continued doing what it is that I was doing before. First of all, he understood that their concern wasn't that he was like a bad student or something like that. Their concern was, oh, okay, is he going to fail this in the future? Is he going to have problems passing step 3 or his boards when he gets to residency? Knowing that, he was able to tell a story where he could address that concern head on. And so if you do this, you can crush your interview. Now, here's where most people drop the ball. It's the follow-up. Number 10 is follow up strategically post-interview. Most people are going to send generic thank you emails that are templated that say pretty much nothing. Or worse, they're going to actually just send no email at all. Instead, this is your chance to cement the connection and to make yourself really memorable. Remember, people remember how you made them feel, not what it is that you say. So this is your chance to really associate yourself with something positive for them. Now, remember back earlier when we talked about asking transformational questions? One of the best transformational questions to ask is, again, what's been your proudest accomplishment in helping a resident through something difficult? Because they're in academic medicine, they're gonna care more about helping people than they are about their own source of accomplishments. And so when you ask a question like that, for the most part, you should be able to tell in the interview how important it is for them to help other people in terms of their values and their mission. But especially for those people, the more that they can tell you about helping others, you can use that story to tie yourself to that positive memory. So what do I mean? Let's say that you ask the question about a transformational moment with a resident, and they tell you, and they say, oh my gosh, that person really turned things around. It was incredible. I have never seen something like that before. And you've tied your story to that. In your post-interview follow-up, you want to say something where you remind them of that story and say something like, I still remember the story that you told me about you sitting there with that resident and really believing in them, and your belief in them changed their entire career trajectory. That spoke so much to me. I would love to be in a program where I could work with people like yourself. When you do this, you tie themselves to their positive memory. And so anytime they think about that memory, which because you asked them, they're probably gonna think about it more, they're also going to think about you and the story that you have surreptitiously connected to it during the interview itself. In addition to that, it shows that you were actually listening. Plus, it shows genuine interest, not just a template of some email that you found online. This will make you memorable among the dozens or even hundreds of interviews that they will have done. But again, the key is that you want to take time to make it thoughtful and not just rush it and just say whatever. Okay, so those are the top 10 things to help you to stand out in residency interviews so that you can match at your top choice. Before we get to that final test that I mentioned in the beginning, my team put together a list of the most common questions that students have asked about residency interviews. The first question is, how do I balance being authentic with saying what I think that they want to hear? Isn't there a risk of being too honest? So this is a great question. This is one that I struggled with a lot, which is like, I want to be honest, but at the same time, there's such a thing as being too honest. I think that for me, the best filter for this is to ask good transformational questions and try to figure out what it is that they value. So like I said, I kind of think of this as like, you've got 20 things that you could talk about, but only 2 or 3 are really gonna land well. And so it's not that I wanna lie about what it is that I'm going to talk about. It's just that in asking questions, I can use that as a filter to figure out which of my passions, which of the things that I care about the most, they're probably going to resonate with. The second question is, what if I don't have impressive stories like the HIV diagnosis example? What if my clinical experiences feel pretty basic or ordinary? I can relate to this because I think most of us, we hear stories of how our friends diagnosed the HIV patient and are like, oh my gosh, I could never do that, right? We kind of have that imposter syndrome. What I can tell you is that if you really sit down and think about it, you will find that there are many more impressive stories that you have than you realize. One of the best ways that I know of to do this is, instead of thinking like, what stories do I have that are impressive? Instead, ask myself, what were the patients that I knew that made the biggest impact on me? They're the kinds of stories that will highlight something powerful about you. You just have to give yourself time to think about it. The key is that you want to just start thinking about a story, and then from there, you'll be able to think about sort of how it is that you can frame it. The third question is, how many programs should I actually ask questions at? I've heard some people say save all your questions for the end, and others say ask throughout. What's your take? I think this is one of the most uncomfortable things that I had to learn, and one of the most difficult beliefs that I had to break, which was that an interview in my mind, when I first started out, was they ask a question and then I give a response. And then they ask another question and then I just give another response. Once I realized that it was much more about solving their problem and for it to be a conversation, it made it a lot easier for me to ask questions and to ask follow-up questions and ask things that would allow me to get to know them better. Because especially for residency interviews, for the most part, and again, there's obviously going to be variations depending on your application and the prestige of the program or the residency or things like that. But for the most part, medical school interviews feel a lot more one-sided, I would say, oftentimes, where the med school kind of feels like they're holding all the cards, and then it almost feels, I don't know, like not like you're kind of dancing, but someone told me that. And I think it's a not unfair description. For residency, for the most part, it's a lot more equal. Obviously, this will depend on the program. But for the most part, you have a lot more, I think, say in this than you realize. Programs care a lot about finding the best residents. And I don't know if it's just the match process or what it is, but oftentimes for interviews, it feels much more, and it should feel much more equal. And so in that vein, you should feel more comfortable asking questions, especially when you realize that really it's about solving the problem. All right, great questions. Now, remember at the beginning, I said I'd test you on the single most important thing that separates people who crush interviews from the people who bomb them. Here's the question. Of everything that we just covered, understanding you're solving a problem, knowing your brand, asking transformational questions, showing instead of telling, what's the one thing that if you get it wrong, makes everything else fall apart? Take a second, think about it. The answer is number one, understanding you're hired to solve a problem. Here's why. If you don't get this foundational mindset shift, everything else becomes about performing and impressing. Your brand becomes a sales pitch instead of authenticity. Your questions become tests that you're trying to pass instead of conversations. Your stories become you trying to brag about yourself instead of actually problem solving. But when you truly understand that the program has a problem and you're there to show that you're the solution, everything changes. For me, I started to relax, I started to listen, I started to connect, I got to be authentic and be myself, right? You become someone that they want on their team at 2 a.m., right? That resident where they see you on the call list and they're like, oh yes, I get to be with. Most people miss this because they're so focused on tactics. What questions to ask, what stories to tell, do I have my response memorized just right? And granted, a lot of those things matter, but without this foundation, you're just a more polished version of someone that's trying to impress them. And frankly, programs can smell that a mile away. So here's my challenge to you. Before your next interview, write this down. I'm not here to impress them. I'm here to solve their problem. Put it somewhere that you're going to see it and let that mindset shift everything else. Because when you get this right, the gap between you and people who match at their top choice is a lot smaller than you think. By the way, if you're wondering why someone would walk away from Harvard and a 7-figure anesthesiology career to teach medical students full time, I made a whole video breaking down that decision. You might find it interesting, especially if you're thinking about your own path in medicine that may not be the traditional path.